video when I was talking about the Women of Marvel podcast. And actually, I think it was a good thing I got kind of sidetracked because what I said in that video kind of resonated with a lot of people. And I was talking about the feminization of comics, because all of these things that we see in comics today that most of us look at and say, why is this here? That's just bad editing. Well, actually, no. The people at Marvel, the people who run Marvel, like Sana Amina, they're specifically putting this stuff in there to appeal to women, and I would say to some extent to drive men away. And this would be things like food in everybody's hands or in their face all the time. These things are purposefully put in there, along with stuff like body diversity, purposely put in there by the people who run Marvel. And talk about what the actual podcast was about and why it started me thinking in that direction to begin with. So if you want to go back and listen to my last video, I'll put the link in the description for that, and I'll also link it at the end of this video, just in case you want to listen to it to hear a little bit more of what I've just been saying. So what the podcast really was about was we have two women that work for Marvel, and they have written YA and novels, as much as a middle grade book can be called a novel. This is what they are. They have these two women. Now, neither of them really were YA authors before that. We have these two that just really work for Marvel, but aren't really there and haven't been brought in as comic books. You have Margaret Stohl, who was brought in to write Captain Marvel over and over again. You have Marika Tamaki, who wrote the disastrous She-Hulk storyline where she moped around and watched cooking shows. You have G. Willow Wilson, who wrote Kamala Khan and purposefully wrote her to be the antithesis of what a hero actually is. And you have a bunch of other people like Rainbow Roswell and Shannon Hale. You got all of these YA authors, okay? And Marvel has been drawing them in to write comics. But at the same time, this is what is going on now. They have people who work for Marvel, and they're starting to get them to write YA novels, and middle of reasons, because DC has also started to do this. Here's a list of the people. They're not comic books. These are either YA novels or middle grade books. And I'm sorry, I'm going to mess up people's names, I know, but I'm going to go over them because you have to hear the names. We have Kimi Gracia, we have Mahi Lee, we have Marie. This is from the DC website, by the way. This is them talking about all of the YA authors that they have rounded up to write YA novels for them. So they take that entire list and then add onto it and more. So there's a lot of YA authors that they're pulling in to write YA books and middle grade books about superheroes. Now, that's the thing. They're writing all of these books, both for Marvel and DC, about superheroes. So I could see this going one of two ways. This could be either really good for both of these companies, or it could be really, really bad for both of these companies. And it depends on what their motivation for doing this is. Now, if they had an actual good motivation, and it's based upon them trying to either been novels that have been written about superheroes, and there's been times where there's a lot of them, and times when there's not been a lot at all, but they're usually around in some fashion. In the 90s, I think they really peaked, and so they're trying to bring that back again, possibly. But the fact is that in the 90s, well, they had it and it peaked because they were doing so well with the other books. They're really not doing well now. So you got to wonder what their motivation is right at the moment. Now, all of those things I talked about in my last video, about this feminization of comics. All right? If they were doing it in an honest way, and not doing it to promote the female while at the same time demoting the male, then I think they could actually do it in a good way. They could make comics that were for females, and they've done that in the past. But if anybody even suggested to them that they make romance, won't do that anymore. And besides the fact that if they did something like that, they would have to create all new characters and try to create a new brand under the Marvel or DC titles. And it's much easier to subvert an existing character that has an existing fan base and use it to your own means than to actually build one. And that's what they do. Entire video on that. But we'll leave it alone for today. So they're not going to write these kinds of romance comics for girls, even though they're trying to draw in girls. They're not going to do that. But they could also do it in a different way. They could do it like anime and manga do it right now, because they do it really well. And I think they do it really well because they compartmentalize everything that they do. I actually consume a lot of anime and some manga, and really, the compartmentalization of their stories actually makes it really easy to figure out what I want to read. Because originally I was drawn into it through horror and science fiction fantasy, but mentalized. You have your science fiction fantasy, you have your horror, you have your comedy, you have your slice of life, you have your romance, you have your sports, all of these things. You got books and anime that are actually centered around all of these things. Right? And you have small horror and fantasy that I was reading and that I was watching. I started to look at other things like comedy and slice of life and sports, and for the life of me, I couldn't believe a handle on all of these different genres. If I want to watch a fantasy, I know exactly where to go. If I want to watch a slice of life, I know exactly where to go. If I want to watch something that's just pure sports, a story based on sports, I know where to go. I know how to get there, and it's very easy. If they did the same thing in Marvel and DC with their comics to draw in a female audience, that would be great. They could use all of those, the comics, and they could do it very, very well. But they're not doing that. All right? So if they're putting it into YA books, if they're putting it into YA novels and young adult novels, and we can see from the list of all of those names that I gave, from the ones from Marvel and from DC, I think there was only one male in the entire list. All right, so they're writing for a female audience. And again, this could be a good thing. If they're concentrating on all of those things and they're writing for a female audience, this could be a good thing. However, I don't think their motivation is in any way to draw in an audience just to draw in that audience and expand it. No, I think there is another motive behind this, and of course their motive is ideological, political. That is what their motive is. That she is on this progressive stack, basically. It's identity politics. Again, she brings it right in there. She is a woman of color from Southeast Asia. So she's a Southeast Asian woman of color. So she has all these identity markers that she puts in there. And she wants to help people of these identity markers. And she wants to put out these books for these people with these identity markers. So again, what they're doing, what she's certainly doing with this, is to push this political agenda, is to push this ideology. And that's where I think this is coming from, rather than to actually put it out there to attract that female audience in a unique way that could actually work. Now, here's the really, really dangerous part of this for all of us who are left behind in the comics. One of the women that is in this Women of Marvel podcast, she actually talks a lot about what she wrote her book about. The other one is instructed by Marvel that she can only say about 2 lines what her book is actually about. It's about Spider-Man, and that's about all that she can say. Now, what happens when a company doesn't want the public to know what its story is about? Well, it means that they want to keep it a secret because they want it to be impactful when people actually learn about it. And if it's going to be impactful, it actually has to make some kind of impact. And this is just me making a supposition, but I think it's a pretty good supposition based upon this podcast. I think that what she is going to do she is going to actually put in something that's going to have an impact on the comics. That is to say, let's say you were a Star Trek fan and you like to read Star Trek books. You know that none of those Star Trek books are actually canon. You know that if you want stuff that's canon, you have to go to the shows. And doesn't matter how much you like the book, it's not going to be canon unless it actually ever makes it into the show. But what I think is going to happen with these books, why they're being so secretive of what's going on, is that they're going to start using these books as canon. That is to say, they're going to put some things in these books, which are YA novels and middle grade books, that are actually going to impact in a significant way the actual Marvel comic universe. And again, this would be a way to drive away the male. It would attract the female because they are very much attracted by these kinds of novels, but it would drive away the male. Because if you or I would say, certainly me anyways, if I was reading Spider-Man and, you're normally reading Amazing Spider-Man and something happens and it's referencing something that happened previously. You have your little asterisk and it has a little box at the bottom saying, see Amazing Spider-Man number 246. That's fine by me. I might go and look that up. But if it's going to say at the bottom with this little asterisk, go and check out this YA novel. You'll actually have to go read that in order to understand what's going on. I'm simply going to drop Spider-Man. I'm not going to read it anymore. And again, I do believe if that is their plan, that is purposefully done to oust us older people who want our comics to be a separate genre. I do believe, again, that that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to crack this open right now, right here, and trying to put canon in of the effect that the MCU has on how comics look and what their characters actually are like. I really don't think that's a stretch to make this happen for them. And at the same time, they're trying to bring this stuff into publishing. Now, Sana Amanat always talks about comics in an odd way when I first heard about it. She talks about it as publishing. It's their publishing avenue. And I thought at the first, what's she talking about? Is she talking about books? No, she's talking about comics. She thinks comics are a part of publishing. Not publishing comics, just publishing in general. And here's the thing about publishing. All right, around the industry are male, and how the people who publish books are all male. That might possibly be the case. But to actually get into the publishing industry, first you got to go through the gatekeepers, and they are your agents, and they are overwhelmingly female, and they are overwhelmingly far leftist. You should look at some of these people's bios. They're looking for stuff that is basically far leftist, feminist ideology to promote identity politics. I mean, they have it right there on their pages, all right? These are the people who are the gatekeepers for actually getting a book published. And so if they can take the comic characters and put those comic characters in the hands of the people who actually control an industry and are not going to ever back down. I mean, we might be able to take back comics, but to take back something like the publishing industry itself, that's going to take a long, long time. So if they can take those characters and put their development into the hands of these kinds of people, they're never ever going to let them go. We will never ever be able to get those characters back from such kinds of people who run the publishing industry, who are the gatekeepers for the publishing industry, most of these far leftist agents which are all over the place with the publishing industry. And again, this is the significant danger for comics right now. Significant, I would say, in many ways. So, if I gave you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me if you would actually read a comic if you would have to go back and read some of its canon out of a YA novel. Alright, I'll see you later. Bye.